In the foothills of the Atlas Mountains in Atlantic Morocco lies one of the most important sites for human evolution. This site is not deep inside East Africa. Instead, it sits on the opposite side of Africa, close to the Mediterranean, and could be the true cradle of modern humanity. Morocco has been treated as a peripheral footnote, an inconvenient northern edge of Africa that theories prefer to skip over on their way from East Africa to Europe. But the fossils do not cooperate with that fiction. Jebel Irhoud does not sit at the margins of modern human history. It sits at its foundation. While Jebel Irhoud 1 has gotten all the attention, it is Jebel Irhoud 2, which is the most radioactive to the Out of Africa story. The world has been told that the decisive fossil for our origins is Irhoud 1, the more complete skull from Jebel Irhoud. But this focus has always been misplaced. The real bombshell has never been Irhoud 1. It is Irhoud 2, the adult brain case that shows unmistakably that the architecture of the modern human skull was already in place in northwest Africa more than 300,000 years ago. Irhoud 2 is not an archaic curiosity, not a failed experiment, and not a pre-modern dead end. Its cranial measurements place it firmly within early Homo sapiens variation: broad frontal breadth, modern frontal curvature, absence of Neanderthal apomorphies, and vault mechanics that align with Skulkafse rather than with Neanderthals. What Irhoud lacks is not humanity, but late Upper Paleolithic globularity, a trait that appears later, not at the origin of our species. When Irhoud 2 is placed in a comparative framework that includes Predmosti 5 and other female Upper Paleolithic Europeans, the pattern is not replacement, but morphological sequence. Predmosti does not introduce a new cranial plan, it exaggerates and reorganizes one that already exists. The frontal breadth overlaps, the frontal angles overlap, the developmental signals, such as delayed or persistent metopic fusion, overlap. The difference is one of derived expansion, not ancestry. Predmosti looks like Irhoud after 250,000 years of regional refinement, not like a population that sprang into existence from somewhere else. This is exactly what a Mediterranean metapopulation looks like: long-term continuity across North Africa and the Levant, structured by coastlines, climate cycles, and repeated local expansions, not a single exodus from a narrow equatorial refuge. The Mediterranean was not a highway for invaders from elsewhere. It was a biological boundary that kept Europe separate, while North Africa and the Levant formed a shared evolutionary arena. That arena includes Morocco by necessity, not by charity. This does not require magic crossings or improbable speeds. It requires only what the archaeology already shows: coastal populations moving, persisting, and interacting for hundreds of thousands of years. Cro-Magnon Europeans did not appear out of nowhere. They did not descend from a ghost population that somehow bypassed North Africa, coming from south of the Sahara. They are best understood as descendants of a North African Mediterranean system, one in which Morocco played a central, not peripheral, role. The Aterian is not an afterthought. It is a deep reservoir of modern human behavior and anatomy. Jebel Irhoud is not before modern humans. It is before the late European version of modern humans. Calling this out of Africa while quietly excluding Morocco is not science. It is narrative maintenance. Morocco is not outside the story. Morocco is the story. And the longer this is ignored, the more obvious it becomes that the fairy tale survives only by refusing to look straight at the fossils buried in Moroccan ground. The redating of Jebel Irhoud to approximately 315,000 years before present did not create a revolution. It exposed a suppression. Long before thermoluminescence and ESR forced the issue, scholars already knew Irhoud did not behave like a Neanderthal. They knew it did not fit comfortably into archaic humans. They knew it shared fundamental traits with later modern humans. Instead of allowing those facts to reshape theory, theory reshaped the language. Irhoud was called a grade, a precursor, an incipient sapiens. Anything that would keep it from destabilizing the Out of Africa storyline. The reason Irhoud was uncomfortable is simple. Irhoud 2 already looks too modern. Irhoud 1 is often presented as the face of early Homo sapiens because it preserves more of the facial skeleton. But faces are misleading if treated in isolation. facial morphology is plastic, environmentally responsive, and regionally variable. The brain case, by contrast, reflects deep developmental architecture. And it is Irhoud 2, not Irhoud 1, that preserves the modern vault. Irhoud 2 shows a broad frontal bone, modern range frontal curvature, and a cranial vault that lacks Neanderthal apomorphies. Its frontal angles fall squarely within early modern human ranges. The parietal organization is sapiens-like in its integration, even if it lacks the extreme globularity of late Upper Paleolithic Europeans. This is not an archaic skull fumbling toward modernity, it is a modern skull before later refinements, with a brain capacity of 1400 cubic centimeters, well within the modern human range. Irhoud 1, by contrast, retains more archaic facial traits, heavier brow expression, greater facial projection, and a more mosaic appearance. That difference has allowed critics to claim that Irhoud as a whole represents an evolutionary halfway point, but this logic collapses the moment Irhoud 1 and Irhoud 2 are understood together. What Irhoud actually documents is internal variation within an early Homo sapiens population, not a species boundary. Modern humans did not appear fully standardized. They emerged as structured populations with variation, exactly as later humans did. This is why Irhoud 2 is the real problem for out of Africa. A skull that old has no business looking that modern if modern humans truly arose suddenly in East Africa tens of thousands of years later. The implications of Irhoud were not discovered in 2017. They were acknowledged openly in the 1980s and 1990s, then quietly sidelined. Scholars such as Jean-Jacques Houblin stated plainly that Irhoud could not be excluded from the ancestry of later modern humans, including Europeans. They recognized that its morphology aligned more closely with School 5 and Kafsa 6 than with Neanderthals. They admitted that anatomically modern features could not be restricted to sub-Saharan or East Africa. Yet, as molecular genetics rose to dominance, fossils like Irhoud became inconvenient. Instead of revising the model, the field revised the geography. Africa became Pan-African, but the north was quietly neutered. Morocco was allowed to host early Homo sapiens, but those humans were denied ancestry, agency, and consequence. This is not how science should work. The correct framework is not out of Africa versus multi-regionalism. It is a Mediterranean metapopulation, a long-lived interconnected system stretching from northwest Africa through Egypt and the Levant, structured by climate cycles, coastlines, and repeated expansions. The Mediterranean Sea was not a highway into Europe. It was a biological barrier, which explains why Neanderthals persisted north of it for so long. But south and east of that barrier, populations interacted continuously. Morocco was not isolated. The Levant was not a peripheral exit ramp. Together they formed a shared evolutionary arena. In this arena, Irhoud represents an early node, School and Kafsa represent later expressions. Upper Paleolithic Europeans represent a further derived endpoint, not a replacement population. This skull proves what other skulls have also shown. A 500,000-year morphological continuity of Eurasian and Mediterranean Africa. Homo sapiens skulls. There is a point after which denial stops being reasonable. That point arrives the moment Irhoud 2 is placed side by side with early European modern humans, not as an abstract data point, not buried inside a multivariate plot, but as skull compared to skull, structure to structure. Once this comparison is made, the relationship cannot be unseen. Irhoud 2 is 315,000 years old. Early European modern humans, School, Kafse, Zlatikun, Oase, Cro-Magnon, and especially Predmosti, span roughly 130,000 to 30,000 years ago. That is nearly 300,000 years of time. Out of Africa demands that this interval be filled with extinction, disappearance, and recreation. Morphology says otherwise. When Irhoud 2 is compared directly with early Europeans, the shared architecture is unmistakable. Frontal breadth overlaps. Frontal curvature follows the same developmental arc. Neanderthal specializations are absent throughout the sequence. What changes over time is not the plan, but the emphasis. Vaults become higher, rounder, more globular. That is derivation, not replacement. Irhoud too already possesses a near-modern brain case. What it lacks is not humanity, but exaggeration. Upper Paleolithic Europeans did not invent modern cranial architecture, they amplified it. Once this comparison is made, the idea that Europe's first modern humans descend exclusively from a late, narrow East African population becomes untenable. You cannot explain why Irhoud too, on the Atlantic edge of the Mediterranean, already occupies the same morphological trajectory as Europeans hundreds of thousands of years later, unless there is direct population continuity. This is why Irhoud too has always been uncomfortable. Irhoud 1 can be dismissed as archaic-looking. Irhoud 2 cannot. Its vault exposes the truth. Modern humans were not waiting in East Africa to be released. They were already forming around the Mediterranean rim. When Irhoud 2 is compared metrically with Upper Paleolithic Eurasians such as Predmosty 5 and Upper Cave 101, the pattern is clear. Predmosty and Upper Cave do not introduce a new cranial plan. Its frontal breadth overlaps with Irhoud 2. Its frontal curvature follows the same developmental logic. The difference lies primarily in vault globularity, a late-appearing, regionally amplified trait. Globularity is not the definition of modern humanity. It is a derived refinement. If it were otherwise, Skul, Kafse, and many early Eurasian modern humans would not qualify as sapiens, an absurd conclusion no one accepts. Predmosty 5 looks like Irhoud 2 after thousands of generations of parietal expansion. That is what ancestry looks like in the fossil record. Even within Africa, deep population structure is now acknowledged. Yet when this structure reaches northwest Africa, logic abruptly stops. We are told that Africa is one interconnected evolutionary system, except that North Africans are somehow barred from contributing to Europe. This is indefensible. The idea that Cro-Magnon Europeans descend exclusively from populations deep in East Africa requires a series of improbabilities. That people living directly on the Mediterranean coast never crossed into Europe, while people thousands of miles away somehow did, that Morocco produced early Homo sapiens, but none of their descendants mattered. That continuity is visible everywhere, except where geography makes it most obvious. Cro-Magnon Europeans are best understood as descendants of a North African Levantine system, not as newcomers who replaced it. Their anatomy is more derived, not fundamentally different. Their roots lie in populations like Irhoud, not in a mythical bottleneck population that left Africa fully formed. The greatest hypocrisy of modern out-of-Africa theory is rhetorical. We are told that human origins are Pan-African, broad, diffuse and complex. Yet in practice, only certain African regions are granted agency. North Africa is allowed to host fossils but denied historical impact. If Africa was truly Pan-African, Morocco would be central. Its geography, fossils, archaeology and continuity make that unavoidable. Denying Morocco's role while invoking Africa as a whole is not scientific caution. It is narrative maintenance. The evidence points to an uncomfortable conclusion. Modern humans did not erupt from a single point in East Africa. They emerged gradually across a Mediterranean-facing population system that included Morocco at its foundation. Irhoud too is not a precursor to humanity. It is humanity, early, regional and ancestral. Irhoud 1 shows variation. Predmosty shows refinement. The line connecting them is 300,000 years of continuity, not replacement. Morocco is not an afterthought in this story. It is one of its origins. And the longer this is denied, the clearer it becomes that the problem is not the fossils. It is the fairy tale built around them. The artificiality of the model becomes undeniable when Jebel Irhoud is welcomed into early human evolution as foundational. While Levantine Homo sapiens from sites like Skul Cave and Kafse Cave are dismissed as evolutionary dead ends. This is not evidence-based filtering, it is narrative enforcement. Irhoud is embraced because it can be safely folded back into Africa, preserving the origin story, while Levantine populations are excluded precisely because they threaten it by demonstrating continuity outside sub-Saharan Africa long before the supposed dispersal. You do not get to include Morocco at 300,000 years ago as central to human origins and then declare fully modern humans living just beyond Africa's doorstep irrelevant accidents. That asymmetry reveals the truth. Inclusion and exclusion are being decided not by anatomy, archaeology, or continuity, but by whether a population reinforces or destabilizes the story. Once that becomes visible, the model stops looking selective and starts looking staged. If the out-of-Africa model were taken literally, if its claims were treated not as slogans but as real population dynamics, then what it describes is not migration at all, but a war, a long one, a catastrophic one, a 200,000-year conflict fought at the edge of continents, with repeated defeats so severe that entire populations vanished without trace. Because there is no other way to reconcile what the model claims happened with how humans actually behave. At this point, the problem is not that the out-of-Africa model is incomplete or in need of refinement. It is that it is not scientific, not rational, and not logically coherent. A framework that admits Jebel Irhoud into the core of human origins while dismissing Levantine Homo sapiens as dead ends, that treats North Africa as Africa when age is needed and not Africa when dispersal is discussed, that invokes the Green Sahara when convenient and erases geography when assigning haplogroup origins, and that asks us to believe humans failed at the world's most obvious gateway only to instantly conquer the planet afterward, is not a model built from evidence. It is a story protected from contradiction. Its rules change mid-argument, its geography dissolves when questioned, and its inclusions and exclusions are dictated by narrative survival rather than data. That is not how science works. That is how fairy tales work, by insisting you stop asking questions exactly where the logic breaks. None of what is being argued here is fringe science. None of it emerged from internet forums or outsider speculation. This position has existed in the peer-reviewed literature for decades. The continuity implied by Jebel Irhoud, its sapiens-grade vault, its relationship to Skul Kafze, and its inability to be excluded from the ancestry of later modern humans, was openly discussed in the late 20th century. Scholars said so plainly in print, long before modern dating forced the issue. What changed was not the evidence, but who controlled the story told about it. What has changed in the last decade is not the fossil record. It is the collapse of narrative monopoly. Human origins research is no longer filtered primarily through a handful of Western institutions with legacy publishing relationships and media pipelines. Researchers from outside the traditional Euro-American core are publishing, collaborating, and challenging inherited frameworks. As this happens, the old compromises are becoming harder to maintain. And as that control loosens, the older arguments are resurfacing, stronger, not weaker. It is no longer controversial to say that modern human origins were not confined to East Africa. It is no longer controversial to say that North Africa mattered. It is no longer controversial to say that Skul and Kafze were not failed excursions. What remains controversial, only because it threatens a slogan, is the final step, acknowledging that Morocco was not just involved, but foundational. This is why the continuity from Irhoud II to early Eurasians now feels impossible to ignore. It is not a new insight. It is an old one that no longer needs permission to be spoken plainly. Once the comparison is made, once Irhoud II is placed next to early European skulls, the relationship announces itself. And once seen, it cannot be unseen. The growing volume of voices saying this is not evidence of radicalism. It is evidence that the field is finally catching up to its own data. A theory that anchors human origins at Jebel Irhoud 300,000 years ago and then quietly treats North Africa as demographically irrelevant by 70,000 years ago is not population biology but a fairy tale, the scientific equivalent of saying humans come from Africa and hoping no one notices the geography vanish mid-sentence. Thanks for watching.